Welcome back. This segment was not one of my original chapters, but a talking point which I think stands by itself. At the time I started writing this, the worst case of school violence in our nation's history was the massacre at Kent State in 1970. So this was before the Columbine shooting in 1999. I was compelled to write about this subject with just that one incident. But now there have been so many, there is a numbness. Less writing with a sense of urgency, more writing with violent crime as a source of entertainment, and what some would call a protection racket. Increased weapons production and militarization to do battle with civilians, a vast majority of which result from misunderstandings and misdemeanors. And this is done in the name of safety. Which begs the question, if ensuring the safety of those entrusted to us is our first priority, then strictly speaking, having students stay home achieves 100% safety. If our nation was at war with an enemy who targets places of mass gathering, Virginia Tech, in a digital age where physical gathering places are becoming obsolete, it would be understood that these incidents will continue for as long as these focal points exist. But in this case, the enemy is someone who grew up playing video games and happens to live right down the street. And if he comes from a dysfunctional family or has some other kind of anguish, he knows that he can end his life by taking it out on 20 other people at a convenient place to do so. And there are 1 million people in similar situations. But our solution to this is fortress-based, which changes our way of life and doesn't prevent violence or even address it. So some clarification is needed to distinguish between these two goals. A rise in the armament of ordinary criminals, civilian groups appearing at press conferences heavily armed, and militarized police used for crowd control are all examples of the belief that guns equal power. Ending violence and its causes is what Gandhi or Jesus does. The opinion that we should use force to fight force is a security concern, not an anti-violence. Assuming that schools will be preserved even when more extreme measures are in place than there are now is putting education ahead of safety. Remember that they equate education with the success of their institution. So as violence continues to evolve under this arms race, they will insist on sending students to a place where they study under armed guard. Student drawings and writings are screened for potential detractions. Militarized police are available for everyday infringements before some students have experienced basic lessons in human behavior. They may have ensured safety for a time, but education has been lost in a myriad ways, the cause for which they will always give safety a second seat by putting students at risk in the first place. Imposing restrictions by narrowing the place and time in which situations can arise and the materials people are allowed to have, thinking this will block violence from occurring, is not a comprehensive approach. It ultimately condemns the student to commit violence against himself in whatever setting allows it. No matter what one's opinion, common sociology dictates that when thousands of people are forced daily against their will to a place in which they have absolutely no control over their surroundings, this frustration will erupt at the most likely opportunity. Young people are infinitely logical about this, willing to destroy themselves and each other to retaliate. For decades now, one of the few unwatched portions of the school day was spent on the bus. So this is where acts of violence took place, ranging from subtle daily abuse to chaos that endangered everyone, including the driver. Of course, the academic solution to this was to place monitoring equipment there as well, leaving a real unknown as to where and when hostility will relocate and what form it will take. The prevention of student violence requires unlocking the reasons behind why it occurs. There is much speculation over this, but without the consensus that such discussions are useless unless the source is found. The only way to know this is to know the student's mind, and they only reveal such things to people close to them. In a previous chapter, I said that students have a greater awareness than what is shown to them. By the same measure, I'd like to ask you, the viewer, if you were an instructor, would you be the kind who comes up to a group of students and punishes the one you see misbehaving as if it was something they choose to do in front of you, while the others snicker behind your back? Or are you aware that there's a world adults never see? I ask because even someone who was once a student can say, well, what does it matter if they're here for the benefit of their young minds? Does that sound like something a student would say? There is a recent study which shines a light on the number of rape cases that occur at college campuses each year. Steps have been made just by the virtue of more women lawmakers being in office than ever before, because their understanding is greater. But the problem is still widespread. On the news report that I saw, the person being interviewed said something along the lines of, I can't believe this is occurring where young women come to pursue their careers. Now, I knew this was going on just having been in a fraternity once, which raises the question, if the experts are 60-year-old women with credentials in women's studies, how firsthand can their information be on what sexually active young males are thinking that leads to this, other than the fact that it's bad? Is this the same reason for whatever it is that distances academicians from the younger grade levels, that is a hindrance to understanding the basic causes that incite hostility? Instead of anticipating these emotions and putting them to better use, thinking they can just be eliminated? If a large group of adults were suddenly deprived of their citizenship and detained in a closed space simply because of their age group, the reaction would be far worse and more hostile than that of teenagers. And yet these reactions are blamed on hormonal imbalances in the brain and other pseudoscience to explain why they don't do what our demographic would prefer to see. The difference is not maturity. The difference is how people are treated. One solution along these lines was a nonprofit program called Peace Games, which promotes activities that combine civics, community service, and lessons in combating hate-filled dialogue. Such intentions are noble, but as always, this approach stems from the assumption that all student violence escalates from petty disputes between students. It gives them no answer to the pains that come from the institution itself. As a student, I remember being constantly warned of the dangers of the influence of my peers by those who had much more influence over us. Just as a dysfunctional family goes to counseling, where the person with absolute control over the family is the one paying the counselor. One can't convince people to be less angry unless they're willing to reckon with the source of their frustration. Even if a school psychologist gets his information from what students tell people like him, maybe he should just tell them what their reasons are. Most academicians are unfit to discover these answers because it would interfere with what they are there to do. But the opportunity is only there for first-hand observers, so the information is lost. When they do try to figure it out, it's almost impossible for a student to share openly under the constrictions and duress imposed on them. You can't obtain facts by imposing your own reasoning on someone, because what we think they should be doing is irrelevant to the question. Whether or not it's a good idea is irrelevant to the question. Earning what many adults consider respect means convincing them young people are useful to the older generation. Ironically, a student learns that a weapon in his hand brings respect more efficiently. Everyone has strong emotions on this subject, but there is a way to make this threat go away and return to the way things were when student homicide was unimaginable, for those willing to entertain what is required. But they won't, because you can't repair something while you are driving it at full speed. After violence has occurred, academic agendas and lesson plans come to a halt. Likewise, academicians must learn to set aside their agendas and authoritarian teaching styles if they are ever going to recognize the seeds of violence before it occurs, just as they do when the fire alarm goes off or the room needs to be painted for the simple reason that it doesn't have anything to do with them. An estranged guidance department will not suffice to reach and convince students. Until the day students feel they are equals, this information will forever be kept secret. Schools can preach various strategies, but eventually they will be forced to choose between filling this need or confining students to what will become a prison. Bullying. In the novel All Quiet on the Western Front, a young soldier returns home to find his teacher is only a repetitive fool with little memory of his former students or knowledge of what is going on in the world, to whom he must sugarcoat his experiences on the battlefield. The pretense that this man was responsible for preparing his generation for life was the justification for his harsh methods and the reason the boy gave up his true passion, drawing, for an accomplishment that has completely evaporated. Social criticisms are often placed in wartime, so the force that is transforming lives is easy for the audience to understand. But in reality, programs that steer people by the thousands towards someone else's objective, displacing them from a life of their choosing, are more commonplace than any successful private ambition. The 2010 film The White Ribbon is a social commentary from the same time period. But in this case, the petty victories of the strong over the weak, men over women, parents over children, bullies over social outcasts, is something to which the school teacher is an outsider. As the only voice of truth about the crime the town is concealing, he is silenced, reducing him to a child himself, unable to even question his own students, and loses his teaching position. This is a metaphor for education being a threat to the old class system. By hurting people and property and getting away with it, the students are actually raising their social status beyond that of their own teacher, who is ultimately irrelevant, learning more from the example of their abusive parents than from him. This country has only recently turned its national attention toward bullying, something which was once only considered to be a children's issue, a hurdle in the growing up process. And from this perspective, it is still being dealt with in the belief that the pecking order that is this social group's particular reality can be stopped by telling them not to, or observing them 100% of the time to prevent it from happening. Imagine for a moment that there is no difference between youth and adults. Just as a businessman can be mugged in Central Park, a middle school student is harassed by bullies because they are muggers, established by experience that requires no more time to make them what they have become, and cannot be easily unlearned. The notion that young people are not complete beings is something that doesn't hamper our objective view of any other organism that must deal with the reality it lives in. Attributing its instinctive behavior to the mistakes of immaturity, saying it would act differently if it understood its world is just a preparation for our adult society, is an argument that is convincing to no one. The social environment someone lives in is their reality. It is an adult reality. Or perhaps the concept of adulthood should be abolished and simply call them human beings. What is the solution then? Just as the concept of teaching has changed from the relinquishing of knowledge and of power so that the student becomes the master, to a state of dependency where the student will always be servile because that is his social position, many victims of bullying have felt the double jeopardy of adults trying to intervene in the problem they alone must face, instead of giving them the tools to deal with it themselves. But even this outcome is unrealistic because people make the wrong decisions and there are situations that can't be resolved at all, which goes against the ironclad judgment adults are trying to convey. Adults haven't brought an end to violence and domestic abuse among their own ranks. There are situations to which they react in cowardice or make the situation worse. So the question of whether kids are fit to handle these situations as we would becomes ridiculous. Bullying will exist for as long as they live in the same world that we do. There is also grounds for the argument that bullying stems from young people imitating adult behavior. Adult society has a pecking order that is ruthlessly enforced. Economy forces an informed, well-adjusted citizen to work a job where he might be required to act, dress, or speak in a way that makes him feel like a child, supporting unwise decisions, conceding to flawed reasoning, reshaping him for subservience. The disparity of wealth is so great that the goal of earning property has become a plea by the citizen to the owners of all land to use what is not rightfully his. Stigma towards the young is a part of this pecking order. The concept of mastery is first learned in the home, then the classroom. Equality has no place there. Thank you for listening. Comments are welcome.